A billionaire pretended to fall asleep with his safe wide open just to test if his black maid's little girl would steal. But what the child did instead left him frozen, and it set off a chain of events that would destroy an empire and change lives forever. It was close to midnight when the vast office of Thomas Mitchell lay in silence, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel louder than it should. The city lights spilled in through the tall glass windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. In the center of the room, a leather armchair faced the desk, and in it sat Thomas, head tilted back, eyes half closed, body still as if sleep had taken him. But Thomas Mitchell was not asleep. He was watching, waiting, measuring the honesty of a world he no longer trusted. The safe beside the bookshelf gaped wide open, stuffed with stacks of bills and bonds, worth more than most people would ever hold in their entire lives. It was bait, nothing more, laid out like a snare to expose human weakness. After years of betrayal and disappointment, Thomas had come to believe that every man and woman had a price. Tonight, he was determined to find out if even a child did. The door opened with a quiet creak. Diana entered, pushing her cleaning cart the way she had every night for 2 years. Her daughter, little Jasmine, walked beside her, clutching her mother's hand. Her small pink gloves too big for her tiny fingers. Thomas's chest tightened slightly as he heard the soft patter of the girl's shoes across the floor. He forced his breathing to stay steady, feigning the rhythm of deep sleep. He wanted to see this with his own eyes. Diana moved to the shelves and began dusting, her back straight, her movements steady, as if she carried the dignity of someone far above the job. Jasmine, curious as only a 6-year-old could be, drifted toward the desk. Her eyes widened when she saw the money, her reflection shimmering on the glossy mahogany surface. For a moment she froze, as though she had stumbled into a secret too big for her small world. Thomas's heart slowed. Here it was, the moment when innocence meets temptation. Would she reach out? Would she pocket even a single bill, as so many others had in the past? He had already prepared himself for disappointment. But Jasmine didn't reach for the money. Instead, she frowned slightly, tilting her head the way children do when something doesn't look right. She climbed onto the chair, stretched out her little hands, and began to rearrange the bills. One by one, she sorted them, smoothing out the crumples, aligning the edges, stacking them neatly by denomination. Her movements were careful, almost reverent, as though she were handling something sacred. In the dim light, her face glowed with concentration, lips pressed together in determination, eyes serious in a way that seemed far too old for a child her age. Thomas's pulse quickened. He had expected greed, or at least childish curiosity. What he saw instead was order, honesty, a reflection of values he thought no longer existed. But even as he watched, a sliver of suspicion cut through his awe. Was this real innocence? Or had she already learned to play the game of appearances, pretending to be good because she sensed she was being observed? He narrowed his eyes, holding his breath as she whispered, almost to herself but loud enough for her mother to hear. "Mommy, Mr. Thomas's money was messy. I fixed it, just like you taught me with our coins at home." Diana turned sharply, alarm flashing across her face. "Jasmine, you can't touch the boss's things," she said, her voice trembling. The little girl looked up, confused but proud. "But it was messy, Mommy. He'll be happy when he wakes up and sees it tidy." Thomas felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. His throat tightened as he watched the child step back from the desk, her small hands brushing together as though satisfied with a job well done. She had not taken a single penny. Instead, she had improved what wasn't hers, with the same innocent transparency she showed her mother. And yet, even as emotion welled up inside him, Thomas could not let go of doubt. Could it really be that simple? Could a child untouched by greed still exist in a world where every loyalty he had known had been bought and sold? He sat motionless in the chair, the faint hum of the city outside the only witness to his silent struggle. Somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted, a spark of hope he wanted desperately to believe in. But Thomas Mitchell was not a man who believed easily anymore. Not yet. Thomas Mitchell had not always been a man of suspicion. Years ago, when his empire was still growing, he trusted too easily. At 45, he carried scars no one could see, scars left behind by a betrayal that had stolen not only $3 million, but also his ability to believe in human decency. The partner he had considered a brother had siphoned money from their accounts, smiling all the while, shaking his hand, and toasting their success. When the truth came out, Thomas stood in a boardroom filled with whispers and pity, realizing that the world had no place for trust. Since that day, he had hardened. He looked at every employee as a potential thief, every deal as a trap. Money was power, and power demanded vigilance. That was the past he carried into every decision, including the night he left the safe wide open. Yet as he continued to observe Diana and her little girl, something strange unsettled the cold fortress he had built around his heart. Diana worked through the night cleaning his offices, then rose at dawn to take another shift at a doctor's clinic. Her face bore the quiet fatigue of someone who lived on borrowed strength, yet she never complained. Jasmine would sit in a corner with a notebook, doing her homework while her mother worked, her small feet swinging beneath the chair. What struck Thomas most was not the exhaustion, but the way Diana raised her daughter with discipline and grace. He once overheard her say, "We always return what isn't ours, even if no one is watching. Our honesty is worth more than any money." It was a line that refused to leave him. One afternoon, Thomas happened to pass by the reception area. He had stopped to sign documents when he heard a soft voice at the counter. Jasmine, clutching a worn folder, was speaking to the secretary of a nearby private school. The girl's eyes were wide with hope as she asked about a scholarship. The secretary scanned the papers and shook her head. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Without the right documentation, we can't process this application." Jasmine's face fell. She looked back at her mother, who had arrived a moment too late to shield her from the disappointment. Diana placed a steady hand on her daughter's shoulder and offered a tired smile. "It's all right, Jasmine. We will learn with what we have. We will grow stronger because of it." The girl nodded, though her lip trembled. Thomas stood unseen a few steps away, the words carving into him more sharply than any contract ever had. He had expected anger, maybe even desperation, but what he saw was dignity. Diana did not beg, did not curse her circumstances, did not plead for pity. She simply reminded her daughter that strength came from within, not from charity. That evening, Thomas sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline, replaying the scene in his mind. Memory of his partner's betrayal still stung, but it clashed with the picture of a mother refusing to bend under hardship and a child who still dreamed despite rejection. The contradiction gnawed at him. Could there still be people who valued honesty over gain, dignity over desperation? For years, Thomas had told himself no, but the image of Jasmine clutching her folder and Diana whispering encouragement whispered otherwise. He felt something he hadn't allowed in a long time, a fragile stirring deep in his chest. Perhaps the world was not entirely corrupt. Perhaps the fortress of suspicion he had built could be breached, not by wealth or power, but by the quiet resolve of a single mother and the innocence of a child. He did not want to admit it yet, but for the first time in years, Thomas Mitchell wondered if he had been wrong about people. The boardroom of Mitchell Enterprises was polished to perfection, the kind of place where silence held as much weight as words. Long mahogany tables gleamed under the chandeliers, and portraits of past leaders lined the walls, watching with cold eyes. It was here that Richard Blackwood, vice president and son of one of the company's founders, leaned back in his chair, lips curled in a smirk that never reached his eyes. His gaze slid across the room and stopped at the far corner, where Diana had just finished straightening a stack of glasses, Jasmine holding a rag far too big for her small hands. Richard's eyes narrowed, and his voice, dripping with false charm, floated across the room. "You know, Thomas, some people just don't understand their place. Give them an inch, and soon they'll ask for the vault." A few executives chuckled nervously, unsure whether it was meant as a joke. But Richard's eyes were fixed on Diana. She stiffened, but said nothing, used to being invisible, used to swallowing the sting of words meant to remind her where she belonged. Jasmine looked up at her mother with wide, confused eyes, sensing the malice even if she didn't understand the meaning. That evening, when the building was nearly empty, Richard's mask of civility slipped away entirely. He caught Diana in the hallway as she wheeled her cart, Jasmine walking dutifully beside her. The corridor was long, lined with glass offices that now stood dark, reflecting only the faint light of the cleaning lamps. Richard stepped in front of them, blocking their path. His smile was gone. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low but sharp like a blade cutting through the air. "Your job here is simple. You clean, you stay quiet, and you remain invisible. Do you understand?" Diana froze, clutching Jasmine's hand. "Sir, I am just doing my job." Richard leaned closer, his words coated in venom. "Then do it out of sight. I don't ever want to see that child here again. This isn't a daycare. If I see her running around these halls one more time, you'll regret it." Jasmine, terrified by the sudden hostility, ducked behind her mother's legs, pressing her face against Diana's uniform. Her small shoulders shook, her eyes welling with tears she tried to hide. Diana wrapped an arm around her daughter, shielding her, her voice trembling but steady enough to defy him. "She never disturbs anyone. She sits quietly, does her homework. Please, she's all I have. Richard sneered, his contempt unmasked. It's not my problem. People like you should know their place. Be invisible, nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving the echo of his cruelty hanging in the hallway like a stench that would not leave. What neither Diana nor Richard knew was that they had not been alone. Above, in his office, Thomas Mitchell sat in front of the security monitors. The system Richard himself had approved to keep watch over employees now captured every poisonous word spilling from his mouth. Thomas watched the scene unfold, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair until his knuckles turned white. He had seen greed, betrayal, dishonesty, but this was different. This was the venom of prejudice aimed not at an employee, but at an innocent child who had done nothing but follow her mother into a world of glass and steel. Thomas's eyes burned with something he had not felt in years, a heat that rose from deep within. Anger, raw and purifying, surged through him. For too long he had let the world chip away at his belief in decency. For too long he had stood apart, calculating, doubting. But in that moment, as he watched Jasmine cower behind her mother and heard Richard's words dripping with arrogance, Thomas felt a clarity that cut through his suspicion. Some lines could not be crossed, and Richard Blackwood had just crossed one. Thomas Mitchell was not a man who acted without calculation. The moment Richard's words poisoned the air of his company, Thomas knew this was no longer a matter of silent observation. Alone in his office late at night, the skyline flickering through the glass walls, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not used in years. "Marcus," he said, his tone clipped, precise. On the other end, a calm voice answered, the kind of voice that belonged to men who had seen too much. Marcus Chun, former FBI investigator, now a specialist in corporate corruption. "What kind of trouble this time?" Marcus asked. "The kind that wears a suit and thinks prejudice is power," Thomas replied. "I need eyes on Richard Blackwood, discreet but thorough, patterns, calls, everything." Marcus chuckled darkly. "That's spoiled air. This will be easier than stealing candy from a baby. Men like him never clean their tracks." Thomas hung up, his jaw tight. It was only the beginning. The next morning, Sandra Miller, Director of Human Resources, requested a private word. She was a woman in her 40s, competent and steady, but now her expression carried unease. "Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully, "I'm concerned about Mr. Blackwood. He's been pushing for disciplinary reports against Diana Jefferson, claims she's been late repeatedly, bringing her child into restricted areas, causing disruptions, but the records don't match. She's never missed a shift in 2 years." Thomas leaned back, feigning neutrality. "What do you suggest?" Sandra hesitated, lowering her voice. "I believe his motives are discriminatory. I'm documenting everything, but you should know the pressure is building." Thomas gave a single nod. "Do what you must, and keep me informed." That evening, the pressure turned into something darker. Diana parked her old car in the far corner of the lot, as she always did. The lot was dimly lit, shadows stretching long. As she gathered her supplies, Richard stepped out from the darkness, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He blocked her path, smirking. "You know, Mrs. Jefferson, I've been watching you," he said, his tone thick with menace. Diana stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for Jasmine's shoulder. "Sir, I don't understand." Richard's smile sharpened. "Of course you don't. People like you never do. You work hard, smile politely, think that makes you different. But let me tell you a truth. Everyone has a price. What's yours?" His eyes swept over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Is it money or something else?" Diana's face burned with fury and shame. Jasmine clutched her mother's arm, tears filling her eyes. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why does that man hate us?" Diana bent down, her voice breaking but still gentle. "He doesn't understand my love. Some adults are unhappy and they try to make others unhappy too." Richard laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Unhappy. I have more in my wallet than you'll see in your lifetime. I should be the one afraid of what you'll do when you get too comfortable." He turned, leaving the sting of his words behind like a wound that would not heal. What he didn't know was that every second had been captured. Thomas, watching from his office through the expanded surveillance network, replayed the footage again and again, each time feeling the heat in his chest rise higher. The seed of anger had grown into something else now, a thirst for justice. Later that night, Marcus arrived with a folder, setting it on Thomas's desk. Inside were pages of Richard's history, complaints of harassment at previous companies, 3 lawsuits quietly settled by his father, a trail of discrimination that stretched back 15 years. "It's a pattern," Marcus said, his finger tapping the papers. "Always the same. He targets the vulnerable until they quit or break. Daddy pays off the damage, moves him to another place, a professional predator. Thomas closed the folder, his expression unreadable. Then we don't just stop him, we expose him. As if fate were aligning, Richard himself gave Thomas the final piece. Late one Friday evening, Thomas listened to the new microphones installed in the corridors. Richard's voice came through, sharp and impatient. "Dad, that cleaning woman is becoming a problem. I want her gone. Create something legal. Theft, documentation issues, whatever sticks. She's too comfortable, and if we don't act, others like her will start getting ideas." The words struck Thomas like a hammer. This was no longer petty harassment. It was conspiracy. Richard was preparing to plant evidence, to frame an innocent woman in front of her daughter, to destroy their lives without hesitation. In the quiet of his office, Thomas Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the monitor where Richard's sneer was frozen in frame. For the first time in years, he allowed the anger to settle, not as chaos, but as focus. The man thought he was building a trap. What he didn't know was that Thomas had already built one larger, stronger, waiting to snap shut. The building was quiet that night, its endless corridors lit only by the glow of security lights. The hum of the city outside was faint, muffled by layers of glass and steel. Inside, however, Richard Blackwood moved with the restless energy of a man convinced he was untouchable. In his hand was a small velvet box, and inside it gleamed the bait for his trap, a Rolex worth $15,000. He opened the janitorial closet, looked around to make sure no one was watching, then carefully tucked the watch into Diana's cleaning cart, wedged between bottles of disinfectant and stacks of rags. His lips curled into a cruel smile as he whispered to himself, "Perfect." Upstairs, hidden cameras caught every move, but Richard didn't know that. He straightened his tie, adjusted his expression, and called 2 security guards to follow him. Together, they descended into the office area where Diana was already at work, Jasmine quietly drawing at a nearby desk. Richard's footsteps echoed through the room as he entered, his presence instantly changing the air. "Mrs. Jefferson," he said with an air of false politeness, "we've had reports of missing property. Standard procedure requires a random inspection of your supplies." Diana looked up, startled, her hands pausing on the rag she held. "Sir, I don't understand." Richard gave a mock sigh and walked directly to her cart, as if guided by instinct. His hand reached into the pile of cloths, and with theatrical flourish, he pulled out the Rolex, holding it high as if he had just uncovered a holy relic. His voice rose, dripping with venomous satisfaction. Well, what do we have here? A $15,000 watch missing from the executive office, and it just happens to be in your cart." The guards stiffened, one already reaching for his phone. Diana went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I've never seen that before in my life," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Of course not," Richard sneered. "Thieves never admit it, but caught red-handed, that's the only evidence we need." Jasmine's pencil slipped from her hand, rolling onto the floor. She stood abruptly, her small body trembling, tears filling her eyes. "Mommy, what's happening?" she cried, her voice cracking. Diana pulled her daughter close, holding her tightly even as her own hands shook. "Be quiet, Jasmine. It will be all right." Richard smirked, turning to the guards. "Call the police. Tell them we have a theft in progress." One guard lifted the phone to his ear. The other moved toward Diana, as if preparing to restrain her. Richard straightened his shoulders, basking in the moment. "You see, Mrs. Jefferson, people like you always end this way, always." Diana's breathing quickened. Her world was collapsing in front of her daughter's eyes. She could already imagine the humiliation, the whispers, the cold stares. Jasmine clung tighter, sobbing into her mother's uniform. Richard watched with satisfaction, his smile broadening as the guard began to speak into the phone. "Yes, we need officers sent immediately. Theft, high-value item recovered." The words echoed like a death sentence. Then, before the call could be completed, a calm voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." All heads turned. Standing in the doorway was Thomas Mitchell, his figure framed by the dim glow of the corridor behind him. His expression was composed, almost too composed, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Richard blinked, startled for only a second before regaining his confidence. "Thomas," he said quickly, "we caught her stealing your watch. I knew something was wrong with this one. Look at what she's teaching her child." Thomas took a few steps forward, his gaze fixed on the Rolex in Richard's hand. He tilted his head slightly. "My watch?" Richard nodded vigorously. "Yes, $15,000 Rolex. Taken straight from your office. We found it hidden in her cart." For the first time, Thomas laughed, a quiet sound that chilled the room. "That's strange. I haven't worn anything but an Apple Watch for 5 years. I don't own a Rolex." Richard's smile faltered, his confidence cracking. What are you talking about? This is yours. He gestured toward the watch, his voice tightening. We found it in her cart. She had to put it there. Thomas's eyes narrowed, but still he did not raise his voice. Did she? Richard, sensing his authority slipping, snapped at the guards. Don't just stand there, put her in cuffs. One guard hesitated, the other glanced uneasily at Thomas, unsure. Richard barked again. I said, cuff her. Diana clutched Jasmine closer, tears sliding down her face, her entire body trembling. The guards moved forward reluctantly, and that was when Thomas raised his hand. Stop, he said firmly. His voice carried the weight of command, the kind that allowed no argument. He turned to Marcus, who had stepped quietly into the room moments earlier, carrying a tablet. Show him. Marcus tapped the screen, and instantly the large monitor on the wall flickered to life. High-definition footage appeared. Richard slipping into the closet earlier that evening. Richard opening the velvet box. Richard placing the Rolex into the cart, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Angle 1, then angle 2, angle 3, clear as day. The room went silent except for the soft hum of the monitor. Richard's face drained of color. That's fake, he stammered. Edited. Marcus swiped to the next clip, zooming in on Richard's face as he tucked the watch under the rags. Your face, your hands, your voice muttering perfect. Hard to fake, don't you think? Before Richard could respond, another voice broke the silence. Richard Blackwood, a woman said firmly, stepping forward. She held a press badge. Jennifer Walsh. Channel 7 News. Care to comment on being caught framing an employee with fabricated evidence? Richard spun, shocked to see not just one but 3 journalists standing at the back of the room, cameras already rolling. His eyes darted to Thomas, fury mingling with panic. You set me up. Thomas's expression remained cold. No, Richard, you set yourself up. I just let the cameras do their job. Jasmine peeked out from her mother's embrace, her tears still wet on her cheeks. Mommy, she whispered softly, is the bad man going to stop scaring us now? Thomas knelt, his stern gaze softening as he met the little girl's eyes. Yes, Jasmine, he'll never scare you again. Richard's lips curled in a last desperate sneer, but his voice betrayed him with a tremor. You can't destroy me, Thomas. My family has influence. You'll regret this. Marcus stepped forward with another file in his hand. Funny you should mention your family. They've already been notified, and they're done protecting you. The room held its breath as the weight of truth sank in. For Richard Blackwood, the predator who thought he controlled the game, the trap had finally snapped shut. Silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clicking of cameras. Then the glass doors swung open, and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the office. Police officers in dark uniforms moved in, their radios crackling, followed closely by a tide of reporters whose microphones and cameras captured every second. Richard froze, his chest rising and falling too quickly, the Rolex still dangling uselessly in his hand. Mr. Blackwood, one of the officers said firmly. Step away from the employee and keep your hands where we can see them. Richard's eyes darted from the police to the journalists, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling. Jennifer Walsh of Channel 7 raised her voice so everyone could hear. Mr. Blackwood, do you deny these recordings where you plotted with your father to fabricate evidence against Diana Jefferson? She held up a tablet and pressed play. The office was filled with Richard's own voice. Cold and calculating. Dad, that cleaning woman is becoming a problem. I need you to use your contacts to create some legal difficulties. Suspicion of theft, documentation problems, anything that forces her to resign. The words echoed through the room like a confession carved in stone. The crowd of reporters erupted in questions. Flashes from cameras lit up the space, illuminating Richard's pale, sweating face. He raised his hands slightly, trying to calm the storm. This is taken out of context. You don't understand. We can settle this. He turned to Thomas, desperation slipping through his arrogance. Thomas, you and I, we can resolve this as gentlemen. We've built this company together. I'll step back from operations. You'll have majority control. We can share profits quietly. No need to air this in public. For a moment, the room stilled, waiting for Thomas's reply. The billionaire stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His eyes sharp as steel. He stopped just inches from Richard, his voice low but carrying across the crowded office. You're mistaken, Richard. You're not a gentleman, not anymore, and no profit in the world could pay for what you've done. Richard's lips trembled as the words cut through him. The officers moved closer, cuffs ready. Another reporter spoke up, reading aloud from a printed page. Richard Blackwood, these are your posts from private online groups. Keep those monkeys in their place. People like her don't deserve to walk the same halls as us. Care to comment? Gasps rippled through the room. Diana covered her mouth, Jasmine pressed against her side. Richard tried to lunge forward, reaching for the papers, but an officer blocked him. "That's slander," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This isn't legal evidence." Marcus Chun stepped up calmly. "Actually, it is, pulled directly from your verified accounts, archived and cross-checked. And combined with surveillance footage, it paints a clear pattern of systematic discrimination. 15 years of it." Richard's body sagged as if the weight of every year of arrogance had finally landed on his shoulders. He looked toward the door, expecting rescue, but what he saw instead was worse. Two senior board members had entered, their faces stern, their silence condemning. One spoke clearly, his words sharp as a knife. "Richard Blackwood, the board has voted unanimously to remove you from your position effective immediately. Your family's shares are being bought out as we speak. You no longer represent this company." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked as though he had been struck. "My family," he stammered, "they won't allow this." Marcus lifted another document with a thin smile. "They already did. Your father called this morning, said he's done cleaning up your messes." The journalists seized on the revelation, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Richard, how does it feel to lose everything in one night? Do you regret the years of targeting minority employees? What do you have to say to Diana Jefferson and her daughter?" Richard shook his head wildly, his voice breaking. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." But the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with finality. The officers guided him toward the door as the reporters shouted over each other, the room a storm of questions and condemnation. Thomas stood still, watching without triumph, only with the grim clarity of justice served. Diana held Jasmine close, tears streaming down her face, not of fear this time, but of relief. As Richard was led away, his suit disheveled, his face drained of the arrogance it once carried, Thomas's words followed him out like a verdict that would echo for the rest of his life. "You thought you could decide who deserved respect. Tonight the world decides who you really are." And for the first time, Richard Blackwood had no answer. Years slipped by, and the echoes of that night transformed into something far larger than any of them could have imagined. Mitchell Enterprises, once a fortress of suspicion, had become a beacon of inclusion and opportunity. Diana Jefferson no longer pushed a cleaning cart through empty corridors. She now walked those same halls as the Director of Human Resources, her head held high, her office filled with the respect she had always deserved. Policies she implemented gave second chances to those who had once been overlooked, and for the first time, the company became known less for its profits and more for its people. Jasmine, no longer the frightened little girl hiding behind her mother's legs, attended one of the best private schools in the city. Her name was etched onto the first scholarship of the Jefferson Fund, a program Thomas created in her honor, providing opportunities for hundreds of children who once dreamed in the shadows. She thrived in classrooms where doors had once been shut in her face, her laughter no longer laced with fear, but with the confidence of a child who knew she belonged. One spring afternoon, Thomas stood on the stage of Harvard University, delivering a keynote speech on ethics in business. The grand hall was filled with scholars and students, their eyes fixed on the billionaire who spoke not of profits and mergers, but of a single 6-year-old girl who had once rearranged stacks of money instead of stealing it. "Power," he said, his voice steady, "does not lie in wealth or influence. It lies in the small, unseen choices that reveal who we are when no one is watching. A child taught me that. A child showed me that honesty is more valuable than any fortune." His words drew silence, then thunderous applause. But later that week, in a quiet classroom, the lesson was written again. Jasmine, now older, was asked to write an essay on heroes. Thomas expected to hear his name when Diana proudly handed him the paper, but instead the words stopped him cold. "My hero is my mother," Jasmine had written, "because she taught me that honesty is worth more than money." Thomas held the page in his hands, his eyes stinging. For all his resources and strategies, for all the plans he had set in motion, it was Diana's quiet dignity that had shaped the girl, not his wealth or power. The truth humbled him. Far from the glass towers and applauding crowds, Richard Blackwood lived another life entirely. After serving his sentence, he emerged into a world that had erased him. His family had severed ties, his name poisoned in every business circle. Once accustomed to boardrooms and luxury, he now sold used cars at a failing lot. His voice cracked with desperation as he tried to convince strangers to trust a man who had destroyed all trust long ago. No one remembered him as an executive. He was remembered only as the cautionary tale of arrogance and hate. And that was his true sentence, irrelevance. But the greater twist, the one Thomas carried quietly, was that Richard was never the center of the story. The true legacy belonged to Jasmine, for it was her innocence, her small act of order in the face of temptation, that had pierced through the walls around his heart. She had shown him that the world still held decency worth fighting for. Thomas looked at her one evening, now a young student, confidently raising her hand in class, and he realized the truth. It was not his wealth that had changed her life. It was her honesty that had changed his, and in that exchange lay the legacy of everything that had happened, a legacy not of money, but of courage, dignity, and the enduring power of a child's truth. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.